On June 22, 1941, the day Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Hitler made his soldiers a specific promise: you will be home by Christmas. He didn't say it once. He repeated it through every official channel, every commanding officer, every propaganda broadcast beaming into German living rooms. Home by Christmas. Mothers believed it. Wives believed it. And most importantly, 3 million soldiers marching east believed it. So when summer quartermaster reports came in recommending 500,000 sets of winter gear be prepared immediately, Hitler approved 0. Why prepare for a winter they wouldn't be fighting in? The soldiers who would freeze to death 4 months later weren't even told winter equipment had been requested. They were told to keep moving east.
Here is what almost nobody knows. Germany had scientists, military meteorologists, analysts who had studied the Russian winter in precise clinical detail. In July 1941, 5 months before the collapse, they submitted a formal report to High Command. It contained exact temperature projections, exact timelines, and exact predicted casualty figures if winter gear was not issued. The report was filed, stamped, approved at junior level, and then it sat in a logistics office in Warsaw, buried under requisition forms for tank parts and fuel allocations, while the army it was meant to save kept marching east toward the cold. The most organized military machine in human history was about to be killed by its own filing system.
The temperature dropped in October. Not dramatically, not all at once. First, it was uncomfortable. Then it was painful. Then it became something else entirely. The ground froze solid overnight. Soldiers trying to dig defensive positions discovered their shovels were useless. The earth had turned to concrete. Tank engines stopped starting. The oil inside had frozen solid. Crews had to light fires underneath their own vehicles every single morning just to move them. And the soldiers, wearing summer uniforms in minus 15 degrees, started making decisions that tell you everything about how desperate things had become. They burned their own military manuals for warmth. Entire operational documents, tactical guides, strategic maps fed into fires just to survive until morning. Then they burned the supply crates. Then the wooden handles of tools. Then they ran out of things to burn.
This is where the story stops being military history and becomes something harder to read. Soldiers discovered that newspaper stuffed inside a uniform could insulate against cold. Soviet soldiers had known this for decades. They were laughing at the Germans learning it now. Units began ordering Russian civilians to hand over their winter clothing. The most feared army in the world was stripping coats off peasant women in burning villages just to make it through the night. Some soldiers deliberately shot themselves in the foot, hoping a wound would get them evacuated west. But the wounds froze before they could bleed properly. The blood congealed instantly. Medical staff could tell immediately what had happened. Court-martial followed. The ones who stayed on the line discovered something worse. Frostbite doesn't hurt. That's the most disturbing thing about it. The nerves die before the flesh does. Soldiers reported not being able to feel their fingers, and assuming that meant they were fine. They weren't fine. When they finally removed their boots after days of marching, their toes came with them. Some soldiers, trying to check if their fingers were still alive, would press them against surfaces, bend them, test them. Some snapped their own fingers off without feeling anything and stood there, looking at their hand, processing what they were seeing.
Nobody talks about this part. Frostbitten flesh, as it begins to die and decay while still attached to a living person, smells identical to rotting meat. By November 1941, German field hospitals on the Eastern Front smelled like mass graves. Because in a way, they were. Surgeons were performing up to 300 amputations per day at peak winter. Arms, legs, hands, feet. When the anesthetic ran out, and it ran out fast, they held men down. The screaming from field hospitals could be heard hundreds of meters away. The men waiting outside for their turn could hear it. And they sat there, in the snow, waiting.
There is a specific progression documented in soldier diaries and letters home from this period. It goes like this. Week 1 of serious cold. Confidence. We've survived worse. The Fuhrer has a plan. Week 2, confusion. The supply trains haven't come. Surely they're coming. Week 3, bargaining. If I make it to the next village, there will be shelter. Week 4, something that doesn't have a clean name. Soldiers stopped writing home. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they no longer believed anyone would read the letters. Some began hearing things. The Eastern Front winter produces a specific kind of silence, total, absolute, pressing, that human minds are not built for. Soldiers reported voices in the wind, conversations with men who weren't there, friends who had died weeks earlier walking alongside them. The cold wasn't just killing their bodies. It was dismantling the architecture of their minds.
The ground was too frozen to dig graves, so the German army, the same army that had precision engineered the most sophisticated military operation in human history 6 months earlier, began stacking their dead like timber. Rows of frozen corpses, stiff, preserved perfectly by the cold. And then, because there was nowhere else to go, and because survival overrides everything, soldiers began positioning the body stacks strategically as windbreaks. The living sheltering behind the frozen dead. This happened. It is documented. It is not a rumor. And somewhere in Germany, the families of those frozen men were still waiting for Christmas.
On December 20th, 1941, 5 days before the Christmas Hitler had promised his soldiers they'd spend at home, the German government made a public radio announcement. They were asking German civilians to donate their winter clothing, coats, scarves, gloves, woolen socks. The most feared military force in human history, the army that had conquered France in 6 weeks, that had driven the British into the sea at Dunkirk, that had made the entire world believe it was unstoppable, was asking housewives to knit them socks. German civilians lined up outside collection points in the snow, handing over their own coats, sending them east, to men who, in many cases, were already dead. In July 1941, at the absolute peak of German military confidence, when the invasion was going exactly to plan, General George Thomas walked into a meeting with Hitler's economic staff and presented a single document. It outlined precisely what would happen if winter gear was not issued before October, temperature by temperature, week by week, casualty projection by casualty projection. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Thomas was told the war would be over before any of it mattered. He was right about everything. They were wrong about everything. 500,000 sets of winter gear. That's all it would have taken. 500,000 coats, boots, and gloves already budgeted for, already requested, already approved at logistics level, would have saved the lives of an estimated 130,000 men who died of cold-related causes in the winter of 1941 alone. Not from bullets, not from Soviet attacks, from cold. From a decision made by one man who had decided that reality was less reliable than his own certainty. The last letter written by a German soldier on the Eastern Front in December 1941, recovered from his frozen body weeks later, contained one sentence that his family received after Christmas. I am not cold anymore. That is what hypothermia does in its final stage. The body stops fighting. The shivering stops. A strange, terrible warmth spreads through the limbs. And in that final moment, the last thing a freezing man feels is comfortable. He died thinking he was finally warm. 5 days before Christmas. 6 months after he was promised he'd be home.